everyone, welcome back to Deeper Roots. When I was a kid, I always thought that the Bible was written in order and in a sequence, and though there might be different authors, they all probably knew each other. Well, over time, I did learn that because of the way that time and human age works, most of the biblical authors didn't actually know each other, and that parts were written at different times. This can explain different languages and different historical periods, different cultures. But what that doesn't explain is when a book like Mark gets, quote, updated after over 100 years since its original writing. So that's what this listener this week is asking. Specifically, how was Mark 16, 9 through 20 added after over 100 years? If you have a question like this one, or you really just want to know anything that has to do with the Bible or the Christian faith, we would love to hear and to talk about it. If you would like to ask a question, you can submit your own question at www.ibbvn.org/deeperroots. There you can submit your own anonymous questions, and also you can see the rest of our episodes. Don't be afraid of asking something that you want just as a refresher. Sometimes it's good to just revisit a topic so that we can go deeper into the subject, especially if it's your own question that wasn't answered. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us here on Deeper Roots. Let's get to the conversation. Welcome back to Deeper Roots. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was a couple weeks since we last had our last episode, but we thank you for coming back to listen to this one. Today we have our new question. Today we also have myself, we have Pastor Luis, and we have Esther here as well. Our question is, can we talk about Mark 16, 9 through 20? The person who submitted this question clarifies, many have said that this wasn't a part of the original text and that it was added hundreds of years after, and we kept the changes in our modern Bibles. Should the canon be challenged or questioned? Pastor, would you like to start?
Right. Well, I just wanted to welcome back everybody to Deeper Roots. We're really glad to be back. And this summer, there's been some interruptions with vacations and such, but we're glad to be back. So we hope to continue answering your questions as they come in. So we wanted to just encourage you to continue sending in your questions so that we can go ahead and answer them on our program. We really appreciate your participation. So today's question, I'm going to be honest, is a very scholarly question. So I'm not very scholarly myself. I mean, I know enough, but I did have to look it up a little bit more just to get some background on this. And the question has to do with manuscripts. And I guess the biggest question or implication in the question that's being asked is whether we can trust canon based off of this fact that some manuscripts, some of the oldest manuscripts, don't have Mark 16, 9 through 20 on them. So basically, have you ever heard of this, Esther?
No, I know we came in today and I actually looked it up and read it. And I personally didn't go to a Christian school, so I have less of a background. I don't have the background of some of classes that might have helped to understand this a little bit more. Like, I didn't know what canon was until a couple of years ago. But the one thing that I will say is, after reading it, the one thing that I ask myself as a non-scholarly person who didn't go to a Christian school is, do I find this in the Bible elsewhere? And that's what I lean towards, because I do believe that the Bible is truth. And once reading it, I said, hey, wait, this sounds familiar. So as a person who did not go to a Christian school with that background, that's the tool I use. And obviously I ask pastor or other leaders, and that helps me. So in reading, I don't know about canon, and pastor's going to be talking about that a little bit more. My response to this would have been, hey, why don't you read the other Gospels and see the connection that it is found elsewhere. So that's one of the things that I do.
Brother Derek, what have you heard about this question? Have you heard it before this question was asked?
Before, like, at least for this specific text, no, I haven't seen this question. I haven't seen this question being posed before. And honestly, for me, this for Mark 16:9-20, it doesn't challenge the other things that were in the other Gospels, as far as I'm aware, right? And like Esther said, like there wasn't, like, if it's, since it's about like the resurrection, you said, right? It's about the resurrection, and like having read through Mark and also read through at least John. I haven't read through Matthew or Luke quite yet, but I've read through John, I've read through Mark, and I didn't see that there were like things that were conflicting. That being said, I have heard this question, but for other passages that honestly don't come to mind quite yet. Like a few weeks ago, we talked about this passage in the ES that mentioned strange flesh in the Bible. It wasn't ever translated into homosexuality until we got the ESV, which was like 1960 or something like that. So those are the things that I have heard about, at least somewhat. But for Mark 16:9-20, I haven't really heard this one. But it is still a really important question.
Yeah. Just so we can start off of why this is such an important question, it's because of what it deals with in the passage. Just like we already mentioned, it deals with the resurrection of Christ. And of course, that is a monumental event and of great consequence to the Christian faith, the fact of whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, right? So the question arises because, let me just give you some things I read up on. Basically, there are two Greek manuscripts that lack Mark 16:9-20. And the names of them are the Synecticus, which is the N01, and Vaticanus, which is the B03. Those are just designations for those manuscripts. And those are two important manuscripts from the 4th century. And so those two manuscripts, which are pretty old, you have to understand that manuscripts don't last forever, right? So then manuscripts were made out of papyrus. They were hand copied. And of course, with time, as they get used, they would get worn and have to be disposed and make a new copy and stuff like that. So then, from the manuscripts we have, these two are two that don't have these verses in them, and they are two out of many other manuscripts. So, what percentage is it? It's actually 1%. 99% of the other manuscripts that we have in existence still today, which are a little newer than this one's, have these verses included. So then the question arises, can we trust it? Because these older ones don't have it, So then there's a couple of things we can talk about there. For example, there's the same issue with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Textus Receptus. There's been that debate, which one's more faithful? Is it the Textus Receptus, which has been around forever, and it wasn't into the 1800s when it was the Dead Sea Scrolls were found that they were older because they were preserved in these jars clays, that there's some differences, some small differences in them, and you ask yourself, which one's more faithful? Which one's more faithful to the original? Is it the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is it the Textus Receptus that's been around? So there's two positions there. Number one is that some people say, well, the reason that they're older means that they're more faithful. Well, that's a position you can take. And then there's the second position, which means no, not necessarily, because the ones that are more copies of, and even though they're younger, that just means that they were in use more. They were copied more and circulated more, and therefore the copies that left until today are copies of the most commonly used one, and these were more like the outliers of those. So then you can argument for and against that position, but the question is, can we actually trust it? And in this passage, I think it's pretty simple. The answer is, of course, we can trust it, because it's not something that comes and changes anything that the other three Gospels already mention. They already mention the fact of Jesus' resurrection. And I think, if anything, what you could say is, maybe if it was not in the original, in being the author of Mark, of course, then maybe someone came around later on and decided they wanted to include make sure that this gospel had that narrative of the resurrection included as well, based off of the other ones. The other possibility is that it's always been there, and these other two, which are older as of today, these two manuscripts, they were actually omitted for whatever reasons. I don't know why. Or people that didn't want to deny the resurrection, because there was groups during the first century that were already trying to deny the resurrection. And that's why Corinthians, he says, if there's no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. Corinthians 15, because there was people trying to deny it. So it's possible that these two weren't very commonly used manuscripts, and they had that section omitted. And they survived because they weren't as used as the other ones, which are composed 99% of the manuscripts available today. So I think it's a very mute point in that sense, in that it doesn't teach anything new or it doesn't make any difference. But the question is, who is right? I don't know. Did it get added? Did it get omitted? I don't know. What do you think, Esther? What do you think is your best guess on that?
I don't know. For me personally, it's nothing I would spend a lot of time in, though I do believe it's important to defend the Word of God. I think for me, when I read this question, was, is it true or not? Obviously, reading the rest of the Bible. I think because I lean so much on that the Bible is true and 100%, when questions like these come up, for example, this one where it's very clear that we find it in other gospels, I don't spend too much time about it, because I say, okay, there it is. There's no more. I mean, I could investigate more, but I believe it. So for me, the most important thing at the beginning, as I said, was, do I find it elsewhere in the Bible? And if not, if there's a discrepancy, that's when I go and ask a leader or pastor to get more information and to understand more. But if, for me, again, at the beginning I noticed it was there, I didn't have much question that or worry about the how, if it was true or not, because obviously you can find it in other places.
So we know that the book of Mark was written at a later point in general than the rest, written at a later point in general than two of the other Gospels. We know that John is the last Gospel to be written, I believe. Is that correct?
They're probably contemporaries because they were all disciples. Mark was a doctor, right? So
Mark wasn't a disciple, though. He wasn't
a disciple, but he was a doctor that also lived around the same time. So you would have to, at least within the 50-year time frame, because of course nobody lives more than 100 years usually. So then they were all contemporaries of the time. So it's not like Mark came along later on or lived a generation later. He wasn't part of the disciples, but he was a doctor that came around and was part of those that were documenting and wanting to write down everything he knew. He was more like a documenter in a certain sense too, besides being a doctor. But they were around the same time written.
So I wanted to mention that just because, we know that the sources, at least when it comes to, the Bible itself is written by a whole bunch of people who were ordained by God to give the gospel message in one way or form, like whether it's like Moses, who is creating the history which then leads to Jesus, or if it's Mark, who is filling in a lot of things that come from the different disciples and different followers of Christ into another gospel. So knowing that, we can see how there is different manuscripts or different writings that maybe they were omitted, maybe they were just found later, but in a passage like that of Mark, maybe could even be one of his students who were filling in the last of were finishing his notes and then added it later, perhaps. So it's just, there's so many different reasons why different things can be added in a relatively short amount of time, considering the past over 1,000 years that have passed since the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the resurrection. different things could have been added, and we have to understand that like these are many different people who have then maybe like had a student who finished the manuscripts for them. Like for example, like Ecclesiastes. We understand that it was written by Solomon, but also at the same time, there's people who also argue that for the most part, it was mostly written by Solomon, but like the beginning and like the first 3 verses and then the last chapter of Ecclesiastes was written by one of Solomon's students, or something like that.
Know. Or like Moses. How does Moses write about his own death?
Exactly.
In the first 5 books of the Bible, and at the end of the day, it's really just one author behind it all, which is God, right? Mm-hmm. So he's just using men who are being inspired. So the question is, was Mark inspired? Yes. Was this passage inspired or added on later on? We don't know. There's no definitive answer, but if I have to guess, if I had to just choose, to believe one thing over the other by faith, I would say this. Based off of that, there's 99% of the manuscripts available today do have that passage, and only 2 don't have it. It's more likely that that was part of the inspired gospel given to Mark to write. The reason is this, because of something called God's ability to preserve his word. That it is God's job to preserve his inspired word, not man's. And God is the one that has been in charge of making sure that his word, in no matter how many challenges it's faced in history, that it's always been preserved. And I would say, is it preserved in 2 manuscripts completely, or would it be more likely for it to have been preserved in the 99% of the manuscripts we have available? Which those who argue, well, because it's older, it's more authentic, I would say not necessarily, based on the fact that the more you use something, the more copies you're going to need because it gets worn. So the fact that there's 99% of those manuscripts available who do have it means that the majority of people used it, or used the Gospel of Mark that had these passages in it. Talking about the resurrection, right? And even if I were wrong, which it's possible, I still would say it makes no difference, because all the other gospels have that same teaching of Jesus' resurrection. And then Paul confirms it in 1 Corinthians 15 and makes a whole discourse about the importance of the resurrection. So based off of that, like knowing that there were already people in the first century wanting to deny the resurrection, I think it's more likely there was a sect, there was a group that decided to omit it and not have it in these 2 manuscripts that have survived till the present day. Mm-hmm. Any follow-ups?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually go back to that that ESV issue. Like, I'm not trying to like make this a conversation about like homosexuality, but also just the concepts of like words being changed across different versions.
Yeah, but this is not a case of words being changed. It's just an omission of a passage. Of more, and it's not about a significance of how it was interpreted. Or like, let's say if Mark says that Jesus resurrected on the 5th day, while the other ones say on the 3rd day, it'd be an issue. But it's basically just says the same thing as the other passages, just that it was omitted in these 2 manuscripts. So what's the relationship to that?
Okay. What's the other question to me?
You. What's the relationship to the issue of the ESV?
So I am, in terms of trying to make things easier, or like trying to get like apologetics into this whole like conversation, this discussion. People have and already do look at these differences in manuscripts, these differences in like, oh, this passage was added 100 years, 200 years later, as like ways that the Bible is fallible, is like it isn't perfect, as we are taught that it is. So since we are taught that the Bible is infallible, can we like do these issues or do these differences between manuscripts and also differences between the versions, like between King James and ESV, for example, or like King James and the Message, for example. Do these changes, do these differences and issues undermine the concept that the Bible is infallible?
Like you said, for those who already come to the table wanting to deny the Bible, yes, of course. But I think for whatever amount of percentage, sort of similar to this is a 1% issue of manuscripts available which don't have this passage. I think for that 1% of things we might look at and say, well, there's a misinterpretation or whatever in this in translations, because it's a matter of translations, not what the original says, but it's just a matter of translations, how people have chosen to translate. For as much as there are some issues like that, there's so much more that is agreed upon. And I think that at the end of the day, for example, whether we wanted to get hung up on the issue whether the Bible condemns homosexuality as per se, as we know it, or just male prostitution in the temple, or heterosexuals leaving their natural desire to wanting to have sex with men just for fun and for sport. Whether you wanted to apply that to that or just say, well, homosexuality is okay. At the end of the day, there's so much more higher implications to wanting to live for God, to surrendering to God, your flesh and stuff, and letting God sort those things out. I think if we want to just get hung up on one thing and disregard all the other things that the Bible does agree, or if we want to say there's no question upon, then we have to deal with those things first, and then let God decide on those things that might be questionable in some people's eyes. But it's not so much that it's questionable; it's just that it is a matter of translation sometimes. And it's like people. It is an infallible word translated by fallible people, and there's going to be issues with translations all the time.
Okay.
I think if you do have questions, I don't think there's anything wrong. When I said earlier that I believe because the Bible said it, doesn't mean I just take it blindly. It's actually the opposite. Like, you're supposed to study the word and ask questions, and that's part of the meditating in the word. And when there are questions that come up, that's when you ask. And I think that's important to also say. Like, I agree with Pastor that when people just get hung up on things, you have to step back as a believer and say, Lord, can you help me understand? Go get help to understand, because it might be like similar to this situation where you need to step back and let God help you through it, right? Especially if it's found in other parts of the Bible, and not just get fixated on things, because that could just be the devil trying to mess with us, because it does happen. So just to say that, yes, absolutely ask questions. I think it's important. Know your Bible well also. That's for all of us. It never stops. We don't know it perfectly. And always look for the truth, not what you want to see, not what you want, but what the Holy Spirit tells you through the Word.
To finish off, do you have any other follow-up?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so I just want to read this from the Gospel Coalition. I want to give credit. This is what they write on in the matter. It says, evidence for these verses is staggering. When we look at the manuscripts of Mark's Gospel that survive today, more than 99% contains Mark 16:9 through 20. This includes not only 1,600 plus Greek manuscripts, but most manuscripts of early translations of Mark as well. In light of the evidence in support of Mark 16:9 through 20, why would anyone question its authenticity? It says, moreover, by around AD 180, Irenaeus ambiguously quoted Mark 16:9 as scripture and against heresies in that's 3.10.6. Justin Martyr and Tatian likely knew the verses earlier in the 2nd century as well. Undeniably, Mark 16:9 through 20 was considered by most Christians early on to be a part of Mark's gospel. In light of all these evidences in support of Mark 16:19, why would anyone question its authenticity? But that's just the Gospel Coalition resumen, ¿cómo se dice?
Summary.
Summary on the matter. There we go. Summary. All right, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you for listening into this conversation. We really appreciate the questions that you send in, and if you would like to send in some more questions, please go ahead and submit in at ibbvn.org/deeperroots. There you'll find a form to submit the questions that you have, whether it's a new question, a question that that you would like to clarify more that we've talked about in the past, or maybe this question, maybe the answer that, or like the discussion that we had about this question maybe wasn't enough for you, and you just want us to dive deeper into it. That's why we're called Deeper Roots, right? Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you tune in again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Deeper Roots. If you want to submit a question, follow up on something we talked about on the podcast, or you want to find us online, you can go to our webpage, which is ibbvn.org/deeperroots. Deeper Roots is a ministry of Iglesia Bíblica Baptista Vida Nueva, which is a local church in Castro Valley, California. And you can learn more about us and our church by going to our website, ibbvn.org.